There are men who've never been insulted to their face, never punched, never betrayed, never screamed at, and yet they are dying, quietly, efficiently, every single day. Not from wounds, but from obedience, from the way they say, "I'm fine," when they're burning inside. From how they agree just to keep the peace. From how they shrink themselves to avoid disappointing anyone. They call it maturity. They call it peace. They say it's wisdom, but peace without boundaries is just a beautiful cage. And wisdom, without power, is just permission to be ignored. You weren't born weak. You were trained to be liked. From childhood, you were told, be nice, don't make a scene, don't upset anyone. So you smiled when you were uncomfortable. You forgave what never deserved forgiveness. You waited and waited to be chosen. That wasn't kindness. That was emotional captivity. And Machiavelli never taught men how to be liked. He taught them how to be feared when needed, and always respected by design. So if you want to be free, you must first kill the most dangerous addiction of all, the addiction to being liked. Because as long as you need approval, you are owned. And today we end that ownership, not with a war, but with a quiet execution. It never starts with a scream. It starts with a smile. A polite nod when your soul screams no. A forced chuckle at a joke that cuts too deep. A quiet "it's fine" when everything in you is breaking, and the world applauds. They call you nice, easy, emotionally mature. But inside you're disappearing. Piece by piece you trade your fire for silence, your truth for tolerance, your boundaries for applause. And no one notices, because the performance is flawless. You know how to comfort others while bleeding out quietly. You know how to make them feel seen even when you feel invisible. But kindness without a backbone is not virtue. It's erasure. And the applause you hear isn't admiration. It's approval for how well you've buried yourself. Because people don't value nice. They exploit it. They know you'll say yes before you've even had time to think. They know you'll apologize even when you're the one bleeding. They know you'd rather hurt yourself than hurt their feelings. So they push, and you keep absorbing, not because you're weak, but because you were raised to believe that pleasing people is how you stay safe. But safety without sovereignty is not safety. It's slavery with better lighting. How many times have you said yes, just to avoid the tension in a room? How many times have you swallowed your voice so others wouldn't feel uncomfortable in the presence of your truth? And what did it cost you? How much of your dignity have you bled out in smiles? Machiavelli warned, he who does not assert himself is quickly forgotten. And what he didn't say is that being forgotten while you're still alive is the most brutal form of death. The world doesn't respect kindness that comes from fear. It respects boundaries, sharpened by clarity, because respect is not earned through softness. It's earned through friction. You can be kind, but if your kindness has no walls, you become a hallway. Everyone walks through you, but no one stays. So let me ask you, when was the last time you said no without explaining yourself? When was the last time you walked away without guilt? When was the last time you stopped apologizing for simply being you? You think people love you for your kindness, but often they love you for your compliance, for your silence, for your predictability. They don't love your strength. They love that you've hidden it. They don't love your depth. They love that you never require them to swim in it. But here's the brutal truth. The more agreeable you are, the more forgettable you become. They stop listening because you never push back. They stop trying because you never ask for more. They stop showing up because you never make them earn your presence. And eventually, you begin to fade in rooms you never should have had to beg to enter. But today that ends, not with noise, not with anger, but with precision. You are not here to be everyone's comfort zone. You are not here to be tolerated. You are not here to explain why your soul deserves to breathe. You are here to be respected. And respect begins the moment you stop lowering your voice so others don't feel small in the presence of your truth. So from now on, you speak with weight. You move with finality. You give without apology. And you leave without a second thought when your value is not recognized. Because being nice is no longer the goal. Being whole is, they didn't need to beat you to control you. They just needed to train you to please. And they started early. Be nice. Say sorry. Don't question. Smile when you're hurt. Agree when you disagree. They called it being good, but really they were building a cage you would learn to decorate from the inside. A cage called emotional obedience. You weren't taught how to think. You were taught how to conform to their moods, their expectations, their discomfort. You learned that peace was more important than truth. That harmony mattered more than honesty. And you became fluent in the language of self-erasure. You smiled to survive. You forgave to keep the peace. You nodded to avoid confrontation. But over time, you began to vanish. Not physically, spiritually. Your voice got quieter. Your standards got lower. Your presence became an echo. They didn't even need to force it. Because you internalized the leash. You thought being good meant being soft. That love meant being agreeable. That forgiveness meant endless access. But Machiavelli would have called it what it is. Control masked as morality. Because the more predictable you become, the easier you are to manipulate. And you were easy. Not because you lacked strength, but because you were punished for using it. You were rewarded for obedience. And so you kept shrinking until your silence became their comfort. But here's what no one told you. The more emotionally obedient you are, the more invisible you become. Not because people are cruel, but because they're conditioned to value resistance. People respect what pushes back, what draws lines, what makes them adjust. And when you stop doing that, they stop seeing you as human. You become a service, not a soul. A yes man, a people pleaser, a beautifully wrapped box with nothing left inside. So ask yourself, when did being liked become more important than being real? When did you decide that your truth was optional if it made someone else uncomfortable? When did your comfort become the last item on your own list? You see, they didn't chain you to a wall. They just taught you to hold the chain yourself. And every time you say yes when you mean no, you tighten it. Every time you apologize for your needs, you polish it. Every time you suppress your instincts, you make that chain look like jewelry. But it's still a chain. And if you keep wearing it, you will never know what your life feels like without someone else's hand on the thermostat of your emotions. So what's the way out? You have to break the reward system. You have to stop treating peace as the ultimate prize. Because peace built on your silence is not peace. It's compliance with a prettier name. You don't owe them comfort. You owe yourself clarity. Clarity that says, this is my line. Clarity that says, I don't owe you an explanation. Clarity that says, if being honest means losing you, then losing you is alignment. And yes, they'll push back. They'll call you difficult, cold, selfish. But that's not a reflection of who you are. It's grief. Grief for the version of you they could control. Grief for the version of you who bled quietly and called it grace. That version is gone. And in its place is someone who remembers how to speak without asking for permission. How to walk without leaving a map. How to say no and not explain a single word after. This is not rebellion. This is reclamation. Because obedience was never love. It was survival. But now you're done surviving. Now you start leading. Power doesn't always wear a crown. Sometimes it wears silence. People don't fear the loud. They fear the unreadable plon. The ones who don't flinch, Don't explain. Don't react. Because most people are emotional engineers. They know exactly what to say to make you doubt yourself. What tone to use to make you apologize. What silence to weaponize to make you chase. But what happens when their tactics stop working? When their sighs don't make you soften? When their praise no longer moves you? When their silence is met with indifference? Panic. Because suddenly you're no longer predictable. And predictability is the foundation of control. They were never responding to you. They were responding to how you responded to them. And now, you've become a mirror with no reflection. They can't read you, can't guilt you, can't bait you. You've killed the emotional feedback loop they used to feed on. Now they throw out hooks and get nothing back. No over-explaining, no justifying, no damage control, just stillness, pure, surgical stillness. And in that stillness they start seeing the truth, not about you, about themselves. They realize you weren't reacting because you cared. You were reacting because you were still tied to their approval. But once that thread snaps, their power collapses, and in its place you rise. Not with fury, with detachment. You stop moving to be seen. You start moving only when it serves your mission. That confuses them, and confusion quickly turns into fear, because they no longer know how to influence you. Their compliments fall flat. Their threats lose shape. Their passive aggression echoes into a void. You are no longer in the game. You are the board they're trying to read. And they're losing. Machiavelli once said, "It is better to be feared than loved." If you cannot be both. But what he meant was deeper. He understood that being unreadable is more powerful than being adored. Because the unknown is unmanageable. And unmanageable people become gravity. Others start orbiting you not because of affection, but because of curiosity and self-preservation. They study your pauses, replay your silences, obsess over your absence. They adjust their words before texting you. They double-check their tone before speaking. Not because you demanded it, but because your indifference trained them. You didn't argue. You vanished. You didn't correct them. You outgrew them. And now they don't know what version of you they're dealing with. So they walk on eggshells around the very ground they once danced on freely. That's the shift. You've moved from being emotionally available to being emotionally sovereign. From being readable to being revered. And it's not because you're cruel. It's because you've recalibrated access. You no longer reward proximity. You reward alignment. And when people can't align, they project. They call you distant, cold, arrogant. But what they're really saying is, I can't control you anymore, and I don't know who I am when I can't control you. And that's not your problem. That's their reckoning. So don't flinch. Don't explain. Don't soften your edges to make others feel safe in the presence of your growth. Let them guess. Let them misread you. Let them build stories about who you've become. You are not here to be legible to people who only read what serves their ego. You are here to be exact, to move with purpose, to speak with weight, to walk like someone who doesn't trade clarity for connection. And when they ask what changed, the answer is simple. You did. You stopped being programmable. You stopped being the predictable echo of their expectations. And you became a signal they can no longer decode. That's when they fear you. Not because you threaten them, but because they know they've lost access to the version of you they thought they owned. They'll say you're cold, that you've changed, that you've built walls. But they're not describing cruelty. They're describing clarity. Because the moment you stop flinching at their silence, stop chasing their validation, stop justifying your peace, you become a mirror they can no longer manipulate, and that mirror terrifies them. You were once soft, open, predictable. You gave endlessly, explained constantly, apologized unnecessarily. And they got used to that. Used to the version of you who could be summoned with guilt, who could be softened with silence, who would bend just to keep the connection alive. But that version is gone. Not because you're bitter, but because you're sharp now. You've replaced reaction with strategy, emotion with evaluation, performance with presence. They don't know how to handle that. Because now they feel your absence, even when you're in the same room. You don't beg. You don't chase. You don't perform kindness as a currency to be liked. Your kindness now has weight, edges, and consequences. You give it by choice, not default, because you've learned. Kindness without discernment is an invitation for exploitation. They used to think your softness was who you were, but now they see it was who they trained you to be. And you've outgrown that training. You've stepped back, not to hurt them, but to heal yourself. And healing sometimes looks like distance, like silence, like the quiet act of reclaiming yourself from people who only knew how to love you when you were easy to carry. You were never meant to be light. You were meant to be whole. And wholeness has weight. So now they feel it. The shift, the pause, the restraint. You speak less, but when you do, every word lands like a decision. You show up less, but when you enter the room, they adjust. Because you're not emotional anymore. You're exact. And exactness is power. Machiavelli understood this. He wrote, "Not for the kind, but for the calculating." Not because kindness is weakness, but because kindness without the capacity to walk away is voluntary servitude. And you're done serving. You're done bleeding to keep others warm. You're done explaining your peace to people committed to conflict. So you cut access, not with malice, with surgical clarity, because not everyone deserves a front row seat to your transformation. Some only knew you in your training phase. They were present for your obedience, not your awakening. And now that you've awakened, you see it. They only clapped when you were quiet. They only stayed when you gave more than you had. They only loved you when you needed them. But you've stopped needing. And that's the most terrifying thing. They'll never say out loud. Because they weren't attached to you. They were attached to the version of you that made them feel powerful. Now, you make them feel uncertain. And uncertainty breeds distance. So they label you cold, arrogant, detached. But what they're really saying is, I can't reach you anymore. And I don't know who I am without your validation. Let them feel that. Let the silence teach them what your words used to hide. Let your distance reveal what your closeness blurred. Because the goal was never cruelty. It was cleanliness. To clean your life of the emotional debt you kept paying in the form of forgiveness, compliance, and second chances. Now, you give what is earned, not expected. You share what is honored, not consumed. And your presence is no longer a blanket. It is a mirror, a sword, a throne. You didn't become cold. You became calculated. Because emotions are still there. You just don't use them to negotiate with weakness anymore. You use them to guide you away from anything that threatens your clarity. That is not cruelty. That is precision. They told you to be kind, to be gentle, to always understand. And you listened, because you thought kindness was the highest form of goodness. So you gave, and gave, and gave, without asking who was receiving, without checking what it was costing you, because no one warned you. That kindness without boundaries becomes a cage you build with your own hands. They called it love, but it was emotional servitude. You said yes when you should have said no. You forgave what should have been remembered. You softened when you should have sharpened. And you did it in the name of virtue. But true virtue has limits. A sword with no edge is not noble. It's useless. You kept bleeding for people who never learned to clean up their own mess. You called it compassion, but it was compliance. And slowly they stopped respecting you. Because people don't respect what's always available. They consume it. They don't admire your generosity. They feel entitled to it. And one day you wake up empty, surrounded by people you've carried too far, for too long, while your own legs are shaking. That's when you realize kindness isn't always love. Sometimes it's a leash, woven from guilt, held by hands that smile while they tighten it. And worst of all, you're the one who taught them how to pull it. Every time you said I'm okay when you weren't. Every time you stayed when you should have walked. Every time you absorbed disrespect just to avoid conflict. You trained them to forget your worth. And now they don't see you. They see your function, your support, your silence, your constant availability. You've become furniture in their emotional house. Always there, never questioned, easily taken for granted. But here's what they never expected. That one day you'd stop. Not dramatically, not with rage, but with stillness. You withdraw not to hurt, but to heal. You set boundaries not to punish, but to protect. You say no not to provoke, but to preserve your soul. And suddenly, your kindness becomes frightening, because now it's conditional. Now, they have to earn what was once free. And most won't, because they didn't come for the real you. They came for the version of you that asked nothing in return. And when that version dies, so does their access. Machiavelli understood that kindness without leverage is just bait. He knew the world doesn't reward virtue it cannot use. And you've been used enough. So now you change the terms. You give with discernment. You stay when it's reciprocal. You soften only where your strength is seen. This isn't selfishness. This is strategic self-respect. Because love without limits is not divine. It's dangerous. You are not a well for the thirsty to drink from endlessly. You are a river. And rivers have banks, direction, flow, force. Let them call you cold. That's what they say when your warmth is no longer free. Let them say you've changed. That's what they say when they're no longer allowed to walk into your life with muddy shoes. You were never here to be everything to everyone. You were here to be true. True to your core, true to your calling, true to the boundaries that guard your worth. And if that truth costs you approval, so be it, because the love that leaves when you stop bleeding was never love. It was dependency dressed as devotion. And now you choose differently. Not harder, not colder, just clearer. Kindness, from now on, will not be your currency. It will be your strategy. And like every great strategy, it will be intentional, selective, protected. Because when kindness has no boundary, it isn't beautiful. It's dangerous. There comes a point where silence is no longer a defense. It becomes a weapon. Because every time you explain yourself, you give away leverage. You hand them the blueprint to how you think, to how you break, to how you can be managed. And for what? Understanding, validation, approval. Let me say it clearly. You owe no explanation for choosing peace over performance. No justification for walking away from people who kept you small. No reasoning for cutting ties with energy that kept pulling you backward. You weren't born to translate your worth into a language others barely bother to learn. You were born to walk in your truth even when it echoes in rooms full of silence. Because silence doesn't mean absence. It means control. It means composure. It means you no longer negotiate with chaos. People will panic when you stop explaining, because explanation was the bridge they walked on to reach your mind and mold your decisions. And now that bridge is gone. They speak. You nod. They accuse. You blink. They withdraw. You don't follow. That's not arrogance. That's emotional sovereignty. Machiavelli understood that power isn't always in the sword. Sometimes, it's in the pause. In the ability to make others question themselves in the void. You leave when you say nothing, because when you stop performing, they start projecting. And those projections often reveal more about their fears than your silence ever will. You don't need to correct their story. Let them get it wrong. Let them think you're cold. Let them assume you're cruel. Let them whisper half-truths to feel better about your distance. Because explanation invite dissection, and your life is no longer up for analysis. They say silence is confusing. But it's not. It's clarity in disguise. It says, I see what you're doing, and I'm no longer playing. It says, you don't have access to the emotional version of me you once knew. It says, if you want to stay in my life, you have to earn it, not interrogate it. Let them misunderstand you. You are not here to be decoded by those who only listen to defend. You are not here to be legible to the ones who only value you when you're explaining your pain in a way that makes them feel comfortable. You don't owe anyone a step-by-step manual for your transformation. They weren't there in the nights you cried alone. They didn't hold your hands when you were rebuilding your spine. They didn't carry your shame when you chose healing over history. So they don't get to audit your clarity. You speak less now because you've realized your voice is a privilege, not a right. You don't raise your tone. You raise your standard. And anyone who wants to remain must learn the new language. A language with fewer apologies, fewer second chances, fewer emotional discounts. You've stopped announcing your growth. Now, you simply arrive as the version of yourself that no longer seeks to be understood. Because understanding is not always the goal. Alignment is. And if someone cannot meet you there, no amount of explaining will save the connection. So you stay silent. Not out of spite. Out of wisdom. You are not unreachable. You are untouchable to those who refuse to rise to your frequency. Let them wonder. Let them replay the last words you said. Let them sit in the tension of your unanswered message. Because your silence is not passive. It's surgical. It cuts through noise. It exposes motive. It separates the curious from the worthy. You didn't walk away to be chased. You walked away because you stopped explaining your presence to people who never deserved it. And when they ask what happened to you, the answer is simple. You stopped making yourself digestible to people who only respected you when you were starving. And now you speak only when the silence costs more than your words. You were never meant to be liked. That was a trap. Wrapped in praise. Tied with approval. They told you, if you're nice enough, quiet enough, forgiving enough, you'll be loved. What they didn't tell you was that being loved on those terms requires you to disappear. Because the more you seek to be liked, the more you shrink into shapes that were never meant to contain you. You begin bending, filtering, watering yourself down until what they like isn't you but the performance. You think that if they like you, they won't hurt you. That if they approve of you, they won't leave. But that's not how the world works. People don't respect performers. They enjoy them until they get bored. And then they look for the next act. Respect is different. Respect doesn't care if you're agreeable. Respect begins when you stop negotiating your worth to avoid discomfort. Because discomfort is where true presence begins. You don't build respect by saying yes. You build it by saying no, and meaning it. You build it by walking away with no explanation. By standing your ground when everyone else wants you to fold. Machiavelli didn't teach men to be loved. He taught them to be feared if necessary. But more importantly, he taught them to be respected without negotiation. And that respect begins the moment you stop asking, do they like me? And start asking, do I still respect myself after this interaction? When you're liked, they smile in your face. When you're respected, they adjust their tone. When you're liked, they invite you in. When you're respected, they think twice before crossing a line. Because respect comes not from being palatable, but from being uncompromising. They won't say it out loud, but they know. The old version of you was easy to manage. They liked that you were nice, that you didn't push back, that you absorbed discomfort, so no one else had to feel it. But now, they don't know where they stand. Because you no longer flinch when they frown. You no longer apologize for setting limits. You no longer dilute your depth for their emotional convenience. And that unsettles them, because they realize they don't get to define you anymore. They don't get to use guilt to buy your silence. They don't get to call you selfish just because you stopped performing. You are no longer safe. And in that shift, you become powerful. Let them say you've changed. Yes, you have. You've changed from someone who sought inclusion to someone who commands space. From someone who feared rejection to someone who walks away without losing sleep. You've become someone they prepare for, not someone they assume, and that's what makes you a presence. Not your smile, not your sweetness, but your refusal to disappear to make others feel comfortable. Respect is not about being feared. It's about being felt. Felt when you enter the room. Felt when you say nothing. Felt when they reach out and realize you're no longer reachable at the cost of your self-respect. You're no longer trying to be understood by those who only listen when you're apologizing. You're no longer available for connections that require you to abandon yourself. And in that withdrawal, you become the standard, a point of reference, a shift in atmosphere, a gravity that pulls only the worthy closer. So no, you're not liked by everyone anymore. But the ones who remain walk differently around you, not out of fear, but out of respect for what you refuse to compromise. That's the moment you stop being just another person and become the presence they measure themselves against. The moment you stop needing people is the moment they start needing you. Not because you became more charming, but because you became more rare. Scarcity is power, and nothing is more scarce than a soul that no longer chases. You used to orbit them, adjusting your tone to avoid rejection, monitoring your words, like a child begging for permission, shrinking your truth so they wouldn't flinch. But now you've reversed the axis. You are the gravity, and they are the ones spinning in uncertainty. You don't reply instantly. You don't explain the silence. You don't perform emotional CPR when the room gets quiet. You've stopped proving you're worthy of connection. Instead, you've become a mirror, still, precise, unapologetic. And in that reflection, they see themselves for the first time without your accommodation. It unsettles them, because when you no longer orbit their approval, they begin questioning their own center. Their smiles stretch wider. Their compliments get louder. Their performance intensifies, not because you asked, but because they feel you slipping out of their gravitational pull. You became cold, measured, strategic, not cruel, just clear. Your emotions no longer flood the room. They temper it. You speak less. But when you do, every word lands like a verdict. You don't offer affection like water in a drought. You offer it like wine in a temple, rare, symbolic, reserved for those who don't spill it. They start guessing instead of assuming. They calculate instead of consuming. You've stopped broadcasting your feelings for free. They want access, but access has become a ritual, not a right. They thought they had you, but they had your hunger, your insecurity, your unhealed self. Now they face your sovereignty, and they don't know how to touch it without shattering their illusions. Because you're not acting cold. You're acting clean. Clean from neediness. Clean from compulsive pleasing. Clean from the decay of being too available. Your time is no longer an open buffet. It's a seat at a table they have to earn. They didn't change. You did. And in that shift, you became the kind of person people remember long after the room is empty. Not because of what you gave, but because of what you no longer needed from them. And when a person no longer needs, they stop begging. They stop chasing. They start choosing. Now your presence isn't warmth by default. It's weather. It moves with discipline. You don't get moved by their silence or seduced by their compliments. You remain still. And that stillness is what breaks them. Because people are used to pulling strings, but you no longer come with strings attached. You became unprogrammable, unrepeatable, unplayable. They try harder, but nothing works. Because what you used to give was never love. It was approval trading, and you've exited that market. Now they orbit you. Not because you gave more, but because you finally gave less. Less attention, less reaction, less explanation. And paradoxically, your silence now speaks louder than all your past words combined. They replay the last thing you said, wonder if it had more meaning than they realized. They imagine your next move because they can no longer predict it. And unpredictability is power. You became a riddle wrapped in timing, spoken through absence. They don't know what you'll do next, but they know it will never be for their validation again. That's when they orbit. Not out of love, but out of confusion. And confusion is the birthplace of reverence, because the mind can dismiss what it understands, but it obsesses over what it can't decode. And now you are that mystery. Not by pretending, but by outgrowing everything that once made you predictable. Respect isn't something you chase. It's something you radiate, like heat from a flame, like silence from a storm. It comes not from what you demand, but from what you deny. You don't earn it by pleasing. You earn it by refusing to be moved by things that move everyone else. You become respect when you no longer explain your boundaries, when you no longer justify your standards, when you no longer flinch under pressure or water down your values to make others comfortable. Most people try to negotiate their dignity. They barter it for attention. They discount it for approval. But the moment you stop negotiating, you become a figure. Others reevaluate themselves around. Not because you said a word, but because you stopped being available to those who didn't rise. Respect grows. In the space, you refuse to fill. In the silence, you refuse to break. It is sculpted in mystery and solidified by discipline. Not everyone will like you, and that is the point. Because if everyone likes you, you are too available to be remembered and too compromised to be trusted. Machiavelli understood this. He said it's better to be feared than loved if you cannot be both. But what he really meant was this. You must become so stable, so grounded, so precise, that love or fear no longer determine your movement. You don't seek their reaction. You watch their calibration, and when they realize you do not need their applause, they sit differently. They speak carefully, because they know you don't perform. You possess. You carry your value not like a badge, but like a blade hidden beneath silk. Unspoken, but undeniable. Respect is not about being liked. It's about being felt, even when you've left the room. It's the memory you leave in the way they double-check their words. The echo of your silence, when they look for your reaction and find nothing. That is not absence. That is authority. You don't argue anymore. You don't beg. You don't prove. You walk, not to leave, but to reveal what they were too blind to appreciate. You don't slam doors. You just vanish with gravity. And that absence becomes legend. They tell stories about you, not because you impressed them, but because you unsettled them. They don't say, "He was so kind." They say, "I never quite figured them out." That's power, not in volume, but in vibration. You became the frequency they can't decode, but can't stop feeling. You stopped begging for inclusion, and they started auditioning for access. Now they rehearse what to say around you. They study your silences. They overthink your stillness. And every time they try to return, to recapture who you used to be, they find a version of you that never existed. Because what they loved was your submission. What they miss is your compliance. But what they respect is who you became after all that was burned away. You are no longer a name. You are a standard, a symbol, a map of what happens when a person refuses to betray themselves for temporary connection. Respect doesn't beg. It doesn't knock. It doesn't ask to be let in. It arrives, it sits, and it changes the air. You don't seek respect. You become it by being the one thing they never expected. Whole. Without them, you were never meant to be easily understood. You were meant to be remembered. Not for your smiles, but for your restraint. Not for how much you gave, but for how little you needed. The ones who couldn't reach you will call you arrogant. The ones who couldn't control you will call you cold. The ones who failed your silence will call you cruel. Let them. Their labels are just echoes of their lost grip. Because you didn't destroy them. You simply stopped bending. You didn't push them away. You just stopped apologizing for standing tall. And now your stillness has become your legacy. They replay your absence more than they ever valued your presence. They tell stories not of what you did, but of how you made them feel small without saying a word. That is royalty. Not the kind you wear, but the kind you become when you no longer kneel to emotions that never respected yours. You used to fear being misunderstood. Now you understand that mystery is memory's most powerful weapon. You are no longer a voice in their script. You are the silence that rewrote the ending. You don't explain. You don't defend. You walk. You disappear. And what remains is a name they whisper like a myth they'll never touch again. You wanted to be liked. Now you've become something greater. You've become untouchable. And when they ask what happened to you, tell them, nothing happened. You just stopped asking for permission to exist.